Welcome to the newest episode of The Process of Fat Loss, where our goal is to help you understand the best ways to lose fat and live a healthier life. Join us as we discuss some of the toughest and most valuable topics in health and fitness. Today, we're going to talk about the insulin effect. So what exactly does insulin do in our body? How does it influence fat loss? And then we're going to go a little bit broader and then go a little bit more detailed towards the end there. So Trevor, I'll let you get us started.
All right, thanks, Nick. So the big thing we're looking at on insulin is we're looking through a fat loss perspective. So insulin is just not talked about enough in the fat loss industry. They talk about it a lot for diabetes and stuff, but it actually has a huge effect on how you can lose weight, and manipulating insulin can really help us get great results. I'm not going to go super scientific into this. My goal is to keep it more of a broad spectrum thing. So if you're really needing the scientific stuff, like this is probably not the right place to go to. But I'm going to try to keep it as broad as possible. So two things to think about are there's two types. There's fat adapted and there's sugar adapted systems. So a fat adapted system is when we use fat for most of our energy levels. A sugar adapted or carbohydrate adapted system, they call sugar adapted, is when we use carbs mainly for our energy systems. So we got to kind of keep those in mind as we go down this process. Our goal is to get people fat adapted. I'll kind of start off with that. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little picture here that's going to better explain what I'm going to talk about. So if you're on YouTube, you'll definitely see it. If you're not, if you listen to it as a podcast, you can always go to our blog listed with the same name, the insulin effect. Look at the blog and it will have it there, okay? So this is going to kind of allow me to kind of guide you guys through what I'm going to talk about. So the first part is, how does this process work? You start off by eating a carb. And we're going to call that sugar from the rest of going forward, right? A carb is a sugar. So you start off eating a carb, so it's a sugar. The body releases the insulin hormone to clear out the sugar. So right now you see all those red blood cells in there. We're pretending those red blood cells are actually sugar. I didn't want to find a thing that had sugar, so it's a little bit easier. So those red blood cells in our mind are sugar. So think of that as a ton of sugar in the system. So what we're going to do from there, insulin, the hormone, is going to release. It's going to pull that sugar out of the system. What it's going to do is take all that sugar, it's going to take it and then put it into that muscle belly, right? So that little arrow point up, it's going to take it and fill the muscle belly up. So the idea there is for the body to use insulin to refill its glucose levels, which is in the muscle belly. Once it refills all of its glucose levels, the insulin's done its job. So let's say it did its job, it pulled all that out and the muscle belly is refilled. Awesome. That's exactly what is supposed to happen. But what happens if it has too many carbs? So that, let's say the first process they had just the right amount of carbs. The second time we end up eating and we don't need any more carbs. There's too many carbs in this diet. So for this, it does this process. Insulin goes through, it pulls out all the carbohydrates it can, all the sugars it can, puts it in the muscle belly, fills it with glucose. But let's say it only needed 20% of that. And so it's refilled. Now there's a ton of extra sugar sitting in the system. What does insulin do with that? It has to get rid of it. It has to clear the bloodstream. So what insulin does is it does a process where it pulls it out and it converts it to blood fat. So in the blood, it can turn to fat, blood fat, and that blood fat then gets put into your adipose tissue or fat cells, right? So it stores it for later on. So carbohydrates or sugars actually turning into body fat. So a lot of people don't realize that. They think fat turns into fat. Fat doesn't really turn into fat. Excess carbohydrates or extra sugar actually turns into fat. Okay, so that's what happens when you have too much stuff in the system. So we have to be a little careful there. So what if I become fat adapted? So when I'm fat adapted, your body utilizes what's called the Krebs cycle. So it uses the Krebs cycle to create energy, and Krebs actually is a more efficient process, and it actually creates a better usable energy. So every organ in the body uses fat. So that's a positive too, right? So every single organ needs fat to be able to function. So no matter what, when we bring fat into our system, it has a cause. Sugar, when it's brought in the system, does have a cause to refill glucose because it can refill glucose quicker. However, we can actually fill glucose as well up through the Krebs cycle. So that's another way the body can create its own glucose. But we can fill it up a little bit quicker if we have just readily available sugar. So, but once that sugar's gone, the body doesn't have any use for the sugar. Whereas fat, the body has tons of uses for the fat. It's used in every single organ, except for the liver. However, the liver can create its own glucose because of the Krebs cycle. So remember, adipose tissue and fat cells are not the same as fat from food. And we have to make sure we keep that in mind as we're talking about fat. That people get that way too confused. They get nervous about eating fat because of the word fat. And that literally is just a horrible design by whoever was making up these words in the past, because they got them they should not be using those same words. It gets people more nervous than they need to. So when fat adapted. So when the body becomes fat adapted, it actually utilizes and breaks it down much easier. So when it's sugar adapted, the body can't break down fat as easy as it can when it's actually fat adapted. So it can use the fat for organ uses, but it can't break it into energy as easy. Once it becomes efficient at being fat adapted, then it can actually break it down into a better, more usable process. So when we run out of glucose and are sugar adapted, our body creates these cravings to feed again. I kind of skipped over a part there a little bit, but so when you become fat adapted, it gets a little bit easier to use, but it also then can convert adipose tissue, fat cells, into more energy. So when we're sugar adapted, our body, what it does is it releases a craving and asks the body to put more stuff into the system, right? So it releases saying, hey, I need to eat more food because I need more glucose. But when the body's fat adapted, what it does is once it's run out of energy, it's like, okay, but I have tons of energy. I don't have to ask for a release. I don't have to ask for more food. I have tons of energy. I have the adipose tissue, that's blood fat, that's now been converted so I can use it. So then it goes through that and pulls out the excess fat over time. Obviously, you got to be on a calorie deficit for that to happen because the body has to utilize all the calories to be able to use it. But if you're sugar adapted or carbohydrate adapted, you cannot do that. You can only do that if you're fat adapted. So it's a very important process to make sure that we're losing weight. So when we are worried about that hunger craving, that hunger craving is actually coming from the body requiring a little bit more and it's needing more carbohydrates. So that's just one thing I think people don't realize about being like high fat. High fat actually helps you burn body fat in terms of high fat, being fat adapted. So can you gain weight after being fat adapted? So, what I'm kind of saying with this, that initial part was I was saying is like, you can gain body fat even though you could be possibly slightly calorie deficit on a sugar-based diet, right? Or a carbohydrate-based diet. But can you gain fat in that? If you're at the right calorie intake, so you're burning 2,000 calories a day and you're eating 2,000 calories a day, no, you can't gain fat. But if you have a calorie surplus on either kind of diet, you would gain fat, right? No matter what, if the body has more calories than it can function with, it will have to store it. That's just the nature of the beast. So if you're supposed to be eating a 2,000 calorie diet and you're eating a 3,000 calorie diet, and no matter what, it's still made up of mainly fat, you will put on body fat. So you still have to have that calorie in versus calorie out equation. But if all things are equal, both the fat adapted and the sugar adapted ones are both using a 2,000 calorie diet. The one at 2,000 calories on the sugar adapted could gain body fat even though you're exceeding a certain amount of energy as well. From there, we kind of we're going down this process of trying to understand the different components of what's happening inside the body. So we have to, at that same point, understand what is insulin resistant versus insulin sensitive, because our goal to utilize carbohydrates is we need to be insulin sensitive. But most people are actually insulin resistant. That doesn't mean you're type 2 diabetic, because insulin resistance does have a scale, right? So you can be pre-diabetic. Pre-diabetic people are insulin resistant. Now they don't have the same fully insulin resistant, but it's on a grand scale of this. So in terms of that, hang on, I'm actually going to get rid of this. I don't need to share this image anymore. Pull it down real quick so we can have a better conversation. So in terms of that, our body can be insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. Our goal is to try to get people into insulin sensitivity.
Okay, so now that we understand fat versus sugar adaptive, I know you mentioned it about insulin sensitivity, but let's go into how insulin influences our body and then dive a little bit into about how our body uses insulin and how it is utilizing nutrients in our body.
Yeah. So when you're insulin resistant, it pretty much means that your body doesn't know how to use the insulin hormone anymore. It's like just running the show. Like the insulin. So here's an example. So insulin, when you're insulin resistant, let's go backwards. When you're insulin sensitive, your body will tell you to release insulin when carbohydrates are in the system, right? You eat a carbohydrate, it comes to the system, insulin will just naturally release, pull that stuff in, and then, even if it's insulin sensitive and you have too much sugar in your diet, it'll pull that into blood fat, right? So that's its process. But it only does that when food's put in the system. However, when you're insulin resistant, the obstacle comes in, it does its job, it cleans all that stuff out. But then after it gets done with its job, it's like, hey, I've done my job, but I need to keep working, because it's kind of like confused in a sense, right? It's lost. So the idea is then it's like hits you for a craving. I just got done eating, but I got this wicked craving. Like, why am I hungry again? Or why do I want something sweet? The body's asking for the insulin itself is asking, I need more work. So you feed it something sugar, it goes through, it had filled all the glucose levels up. So all it's literally going to do from that point is it's going to take that extra sugar and put it right into your fat cells. Right? So it's literally just making fat. So every single time you have that craving, right after you ate a ton of calories, your body's literally just taking the extra calories and putting it into body fat, which totally sucks. But that's when you're insulin resistant. But then, you could, so somebody that's like slightly insulin resistant, they might have one craving. Somebody that's close to that type 2 diabetic, they might have 4 or 5 cravings that happen in that amount of time, or happen multiple times throughout the day because their insulin hormone is so lost, it doesn't even know what it's done. It doesn't even know it's actually completed its job really, because it just keeps looking for more. So that's why it's like, when we're talking about having too many carbohydrates, that's the issue. Is like if we're having too many carbohydrates and we're insulin resistant, our body's just literally building tons and tons of body fat. So what we have to do is eliminate that sugar, right? We have to eliminate the carbohydrates in the system to allow our body to start working on becoming fat adapted so it can continue to go back to being insulin resistant. So it's okay to have carbohydrates in a diet. We're not demonizing carbohydrates by any means, but we sometimes have to take a break from carbs to help us become insulin sensitive so we can better utilize carbs. And if we're not a super active person, we actually probably need to keep our carbs relatively low. Super active would be over an hour a day consistently, right, of exercise or movement, like really big, intense movement. It doesn't have to be intense, but definitely moderate movement. So in terms of that, like we need to kind of keep that our calorie levels just a little, not calorie levels, sorry, our carbohydrate levels a little bit low. Okay, so kind of like how do we become insulin sensitive then, right? So if we understand that we're insulin resistant because we're getting sugar cravings, we know that our body's producing insulin all the time, trying to get me to do more. So I'm insulin resistant. Especially I usually tell people if they're getting wicked cravings consistently, they probably do have a level of insulin resistance. So then how do we go to sensitivity? Realistically, the most important way to get to the insulin sensitivity is you got to drop body fat. People that are insulin resistant are usually over a certain percentage body fat. We see it usually, and these aren't exact terms. These are just what we see people moving towards insulin resistant. So like if you're a male above 20% body fat, you're probably moving into a higher and higher level of insulin resistant every percentage you go up higher. A female at 28% higher, same thing. Like they, at 28%, they're probably barely insulin resistant. They might get a craving here or there, but as they start to climb up that insulin resistance to say 32, 35% body fat, they probably have become insulin resistant and more on that scale of insulin resistance. So these numbers don't exactly mean that you're insulin resistant, but it gives a kind of an idea like, hey, as my body fat gets higher, I probably end up with higher cravings. So what we have to do is we have to decrease body fat. One of the best ways to decrease body fat and to decrease these insulin insulin like hormone stuff is to go low carb. This will at least reduce the effect of insulin on the body. So if we have a lower carb in our system, it means that we aren't triggering insulin. So then every single time we have an insulin feeling, right? Like, oh my God, I have a craving, but I don't have any carbohydrates in my system or very few carbs. That tells me that insulin itself is going kind of wild and I need to not feed the beast, right? We call it the sugar dragon. Don't feed the sugar dragon. So the idea is because you need to start to work towards that fat adapted so you don't have those cravings anymore and you can get it out of insulin resistance.
All right. So that was a great breakdown of insulin resistance versus insulin sensitivity. What are some things that we can implement into our lives right now to help insulin function the best and then allow our bodies to utilize nutrients the best?
So one of the most important things you can do is like go to a low carb diet in the beginning, especially if you feel like you're insulin resistant. So go to a low carb diet to start with. You can always go back to a little bit higher carb diet once you feel like you've achieved insulin sensitivity. And I told you the body fat percentage is there. So and then like kind of the long-term strategy is that you work out 1 hour less a day. You should just stay on low carbohydrates, which is 20% or less consistently. You just don't need the excess carbs because those excess carbs are going to turn into body fat. Another thing is don't snack as your consistent. Don't snack at all, right? So eat your 2 or 3 meals a day, and that's it. Try not to snack in between because that snacking in between actually spikes insulin levels because the insulin hormone is released and then it wants to be released again and released again. What we're trying to do is stop it from being released at all. Like it'll release regardless when you eat. Even if you don't have a carbohydrate, it'll release a little bit, but it's not going to release at the same level that if you feed a carbohydrate. So we're trying to stop the amount of release times. And I know you've been told, let's supposed to eat 6 times a day, but that's really a bodybuilder routine. Like that's not really a fat loss routine. A fat loss routine is eating 2 or 3 times a day max. And so increase, those things that we talked about are really trying to increase your insulin sensitivity by reducing body fat. So you really have to work on reducing body fat. So if you're insulin resistant or you feel like your body fat percentage is in a category of that, you need to get on a program that helps you go low carb and lose body fat. That's why we developed our roadmaps. Our roadmaps are low carb ideas to give people guidance to help them get rid of insulin resistance so they become insulin sensitive again. Even people that are doing long distance running stuff, I still want them to get to insulin sensitivity if their body fat percentage is over a certain level so that they can maximize the carbohydrate intake when it comes down the road. So everybody really needs to go through low carb at a certain point. So adipose tissue, and the last thing I want to say on this is remember adipose tissue, which is fat cells. When you hear fat, it is not the same thing as fat in your food, right? And quit getting those things confused. Because you eat fat does not make you fat. Honestly, by eating fat, you become not fat. So remember that fat is good. Whereas adipose tissue, that's a whole different thing. That's how your body stores fat. And that actually comes from too high carbohydrate and sugar level, or just having a calorie surplus. If you're overeating in general, if you're eating blocks of cheese a day and you're hitting 3,000 calories in cheese, you probably are overdoing fat as well.
All right. So if people want to learn more about insulin, how it affects our body, where would you suggest they look for a little more information on that?
One of my favorite things is actually the Primal Fat Burner book by Nora. I don't remember how to say her last name. It's like a goddess. So she really talks about insulin, how insulin affects the body. That kind of was what woke me up about understanding insulin and how it actually affects fat gain, right? And fat loss. So that's it's a deep book, and it goes into things that I don't believe in 100% of the things they say. However, I do really believe that component. So it was really good. The other one is there's a really good article from Precision Nutrition, which is a website we use for a lot of things. That's what we're certified through as precision nutrition coaches. They have a truth about insulin, carbs, and weight loss. So it's a good article that kind of breaks down that. They never go too extreme on anything, but the idea is they're not asking to go zero carb. We're talking more of getting in that 10 to 20% carb for a long enough period of time to become insulin sensitive.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion on today's topic. Remember, the best time to start living healthier is today, so make sure to take some action in your life right away. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a review, subscribe on YouTube, and follow us on social media to stay up to date on upcoming episodes and topics. If you have any suggestions of topics that you'd like us to talk about, just send us an email or message us on social media, and we might get to those topics in future episodes. Like we said before, the link or the article Trevor talked about, and then the book will be linked in the blog. So just check that out for those links. Thanks again, and I hope you will join us for the next episode of The Process of Fat Loss.
And guys, if we challenged your thought process at all, comment, talk to us. We want to have these conversations. That's what we're here for. So please don't be afraid to say things and ask us questions. We're not here to be we're not dogmatic. We want to really talk about these things. So just reach out anytime. We're willing to have a conversation, explain our side, and explain how we can help you guys.